We're going through Corinthians. Before we start the reading, I'll just point out, we're going to take a little section, but in this section, it's quite a long section, a bit of homework, if you're up for it. Hopefully you will be up for it by the end of this, to read chapters 5 through to 10 in the week. And then every now and again the sermon will make sense to you. So we're picking a little bit, but it's a backwards and forwards between Paul and the church. They've asked some questions and he's doing his best to give them some answers. And the little bit we're going to read now, but I'll be drawing other bits in during our reflection, is answering questions about marriage. So we'll pick this bit up. So Paul starts running through the list of the things that they've asked, and he says, "To the unmarried and to the widows, I say that it is well for them to remain unmarried as I am. But if they are not practicing self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to be aflame with passion. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord, that the wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does separate, let her remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and that her husband should not divorce the wife. To the rest, I say, I, and not the Lord, that if any believer has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. And if any woman has a husband who is a believer and he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband is made holy through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy through her husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such a case, the brother or sister is not bound. It is to peace that God has called you. Wife, for all you know, you might save your husband. Husband, for all you know, you might save your wife." So, Paul started the letter to the Corinthians, as we've seen a couple of times now, with this whole question of divisions. He said, "I've heard, scandalously, that there are divisions amongst you, and that as a result, there's boasting." There's boasting. And there's not people turning up and going, "Oh, I'm the fastest," or "I'm the tallest," or, "I'm the cleverest." It's not that sort of boasting. It's the sort of boasting saying, "Me and my group are right, and you and your group are wrong." Probably wouldn't say that to their face, he'd say that behind their back. "We're right, and that lot they're dodgy." That kind of thing going on. And a little bit, you can imagine, we've had a week of elections, so we might have a little sense of that. Imagine if you shrunk the whole sort of national scene into this room now, and there'll be groups of people going around saying, "I'm for Nigel." Someone had to say it. "I'm for Nigel." Another will go, no, "I'm for Kemi." Someone else saying, "I'm for Keir." I mean, there might not be anyone saying that in this. And someone else saying, "I'm for Zach." There are others, you get the picture. And then a bit of bragging, a bit of boasting. "We're right, we're going to put the country to right." You lot would send it down the pan. It's not beyond the stretch of the imagination, is it? The kind of good-humoured banter and the kind of nastiness that could, if it got out of hand. And Paul's just saying, no, that's not how we do things. And last week, we picked up on that. One of the things, we don't do it like that because we are called not to judge. So there is no point in judging, because part of the reason for this is none of us are completely right. So we need to work out how to live together, to share our views, to work out what is right. But at the end of the do not judge, often there's a problem that comes up, and it says, what if you can't judge? How do you work out what's right? Does that just lead to disinterest in each other? If I can't judge anyone, how do we get to the bottom of issues? How do we say what's right and wrong? Do I end up having to just say, well, you have your truth, I have my truth, and that's the way it goes. You voted for Nigel, I voted for Keir. You won, or whatever. And you become just disinterested because you're not allowed to talk, you're not allowed to judge, you're not allowed to argue. What do you do? And in this section, and that's why it's worth reading this section 5 to 10, 1 Corinthians 5 to 10, we realise that it doesn't lead to disinterest at all. It leads to the hard work of conversation. It leads to the hard work of saying, so what are the issues? How do we work through these things together? Paul wants to get into those kind of conversations. And in actual fact, just the structure of this, it's a letter, it's a correspondence, it's a backwards and forwards. And it's a really dense bit of the New Testament because in actual fact, we got 2 letters, 1 and 2 Corinthians. There were 2 letters sent. So here we have a little bit of correspondence, 4 letters, backwards and forwards. If they'd been in person, they would have just been having some serious conversations. And Baptists and other churches like us have come to the conclusion that actually these conversations are often how God works. When Paul said earlier in the chapter, we have the mind of Christ. It wasn't just dropped out of heaven and we've got it. It came through the hard work of backwards and forwards, of conversations, of working it out. And so I'm going to spend a few moments, and unfortunately we can't really get into any of them in any great detail, but looking at 3 elements of Paul's work at conversation in this. And the first one, if we'd read all of chapter 5, we would have got this, that Paul starts by saying, well, we won't judge, but in actual fact, we can all agree on some things. He says this, it always starts with sex, so he says, it's actually reported to you that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a sort that is not even found in the wider society. So that's where he starts. He's scandalised that there are divisions, now he's scandalised saying, what's going on? And Paul is looking for agreement. He's saying, there are some things that shouldn't be worse in the church than elsewhere. He sets the bar quite low. We don't want to be here being worse than everybody else in certain issues. And as I say, his example is about sexual immorality, because that's what he sees or hears is happening in the church. And it's a bit of a messy example, so we won't spend too much time. He says, there's a person living with his father's wife. It's a bit messy because we don't know exactly the details. It's not incest, he's not living with his mother. We don't know if the father's dead, we don't know if the father's divorced, we just know that this kind of activity is frowned on. And Paul says to the church, come on, surely we can agree that can't be right. Now, he's not looking, he thinks he's landed on a example that is cast iron. You know, he can't quite understand why they haven't worked it out themselves because the church are putting up with this. In fact, some of them are even boasting that that's fine. In that culture, definitely, any form, probably would be frowned on in our culture. It might be a bit distasteful, I don't know. But Paul thinks no one puts up with this, so we shouldn't put up with it. If we take another example, it's probably easier for us to get to the bottom of it. If Paul had said, I hear there's a loan shark in your church who charges increasing percentages on loans to poor families. And then he said to the church, come on guys, that's frowned on everywhere. Why are you putting up with it? You kind of get the picture. He's saying, this isn't, I'm with Apollos, I'm with Paul. We can all agree on that. Surely we can come to a consensus on some sort of thing. So if a loan shark comes in, we say, well, you have to just give up being a loan shark, otherwise you're not really welcome. And Paul doesn't think that's being judgmental. He says that's just an agreement on some basic standards that we have and we arrive at together. So he says he's doing the work of conversation. This is a backwards and forwards saying, can we arrive at a consensus here? Some things we just won't put up with. It's not factions. It's all of us talking about it and seeing what we think is right and wrong. And as I say, Paul thinks he's landed on an easy one. We can all agree. And there are easy ones that we can all agree on. And it's a little bit different to democracy. He's not calling for a vote and the majority wins. He's talking about a consensus where we go backwards and forwards. We really hear each other, we really listen, and at times we feel like we can take a stand on something and say, we think this is right. We think together this is right. And in actual fact, that's what the church members' meeting exists for, is supposed to exist for, looking at things that we might need to take a stand on. So that's the first. The next one is, Paul uses conversation to correct people. So here he gets, he's a teacher, and he says some things are just need corrections. What he's really trying to do, and I'll go through one example of it, is he's trying to introduce better conversations and better ideas. So he has a nasty feeling in chapter 6 that the Corinthians have misunderstood something about the gospel. They've been told not to judge each other, so we think, so great. Because they're told not to judge each other, a group of them have started thinking, well, if you can't judge, it means you can do what you want. And that was rooted in some quite specific and quite bad theology. And the theology was this: God has saved my soul, the rest of me doesn't matter. So if I'm saved, if I'm forgiven, if it's all spiritual, the Holy Spirit inside me, what I do with my body, well, that doesn't really matter, isn't it? It's not anything to do with faith. And they had this little slogan that went with it, and it was simply this: it's as if they had lived in the 60s, anything goes. I'm forgiven, no one can judge me, it's all spiritual. So what I do is up to me. You know where this is going to go, don't you? This goes in two directions. It goes around sex and food. I can eat what I want, and I can do what I want sexually. It's like the gospel for midlife crisis. It's just, that's where it went. A lack of imagination in some respects. And Paul just says, alongside this slogan, this anything goes, he just puts some other observations. So he doesn't come down heavy. He just says, how does that work out? So anything goes. The phrase in the Greek would be, everything is permissible to me. But let's go. Everything goes. And he said, yeah, but I won't be dominated by anything. If you live greedily, in the end it's not freedom, it's a form of slavery. We can think of some simple examples of that. You start smoking, you say, I'm free to smoke. I remember saying that to my mum. And then 2 years down the line, you can't function without a cigarette for a while. And Paul would just want to say that. Anything goes. Yeah, but some things will just get you rather than you get them. Then it says everything goes because the body doesn't matter. And Paul just says, but didn't God raise Jesus bodily from the dead? Doesn't the Holy Spirit fall on you and your body? Aren't you the temple of the Holy Spirit? What goes on in your body does matter. He just throws that in there. They say again, everything goes. On this bit you have to move on to chapter 10, and it's to do with food. Everything's allowed. And he said, yeah, but not everything's good, is it? You still need some discernment. You're not supposed to just say, I can do whatever I want. And then they come back again. Anything goes. And he says, yeah, but some things don't build up. Some things don't build up the church. Some things don't build up your neighbour. Some things don't build up you. So don't do those. So what Paul is saying here is this isn't judgment, but it is interest. He said, oh, you think anything goes. Well, what about, and he has 4 observations. Anything goes, but what you're doing, is it doing you good and doing others good? Anything goes. But is it dominating you, or is it healthy? Anything goes. Are you ignoring that you're supposed to do good in your body, that God cares for your bodily life? He lays on these other considerations. He has conversations. And that requires, he's not just laying down the law, this requires proper listening. Because he's asked the question, well, what about? You've got to listen to the answer. It's not a gotcha. He's saying, let's talk about this. Let's really hear each other. And you know and I know that if you have those conversations, it happens sometimes, doesn't it? You have your views and you think somebody's really listened to you and invited you to listen to them. And those are conversations that can change your life. And that's what Paul practices. So he says, it's not judgmentalism. but I do care about what's going on, and I will talk to you about it, and I will throw my bit in as well as listen to your bit. Lastly, so we've had, I'm quite pleased with myself this week because this is rare, but I've got 2 C's already. I hope you noticed that. He's looked for consensus, he's corrected them, and then lastly, he pays attention to the context of people's lives. And this is the real problem with judgmentalism, isn't it? You rush to easy judgments because you live out of formulas. This is right, this is wrong. That's easy. And Paul instead listens, and this was the reading we had, chapter 7, worth reading the whole chapter. He listens to all the little bits and particulars of the details of people's lives. They've sent him a whole list of things. What do you do in this situation? What do you do in this? What do you do? He doesn't give a one-size-fits-all answer. He takes the list bit by bit. Have you ever heard that phrase, no ifs, no buts? So, I used to get this regularly when I was younger. Do this, my dad would say. No ifs, no buts, just do it. What it meant was the circumstances of my life didn't really matter. That's how I took it, at least. No ifs, no buts. No excuses, no objections. Yes or no? Well, Paul won't do that. He knows better that life doesn't work with no ifs, no buts. In fact, if you read chapter 7, it is structured around ifs and buts. Because life is made up of ifs and buts. So he says this, to the unmarried and the widows, stay unmarried, like me. Evidently, Paul was either widowed, or probably widowed. Stay unmarried. So that's clear. You'd think, well, that's a great piece of advice. To those of you who are widowed or unmarried, just stay as you are. Listen up. But then he says, but if you can't, then get married. And you can imagine the no ifs, no buts, the yes or no. Going, well, which is it, Paul? Is it yes or is it no? Paul says, well, if you can do that, and if you can't, then do this. There are only 2 options, get married or don't get married. Paul has a very high view of marriage. He wants to see people in committed relationships. And he says, well, if you can, do it this way, and if you can't, go through the other. To the married, this is the more detailed one. To the married, he says, I say, stay married. And he says, not only this, but handily and usefully, I've got a message from Jesus, a command from Jesus on this. He says, Jesus said, do not separate. It comes from Jesus. So you think that's definitely the one where there's no ifs, there's no buts, because Jesus said it. But Paul follows it up with another if. Don't separate, so Jesus said, but if you do. But if you do. He doesn't say no ifs, no buts. He said, Jesus said don't, but if you do. And that's important because what he's really saying is that, but if you do, there's a place for you in the community of grace. If you do, if your life goes that way, if for all sorts of circumstances, he knows this isn't a rule. This could be to do with the tragedies of life, definitely the details of life. He says, if you do, just do this, don't get married again. And that only to the people, to the person doing the leaving. He said, if you separate, then don't get married again. And you see the sensibleness here. He's not judging, he's not condemning. He says, don't separate, but if you do, don't leave the church. And definitely to the leave, don't put people out for this. There's a but if right in the middle of that. There's no mention of put people out here. But if. And the boldness of the statement, and this we could talk about after coffee, the boldness of the statement comes back because Paul qualified Jesus. He said, do not separate, but if you do, stay unmarried. There's a but if logic there. Can we add a but if to what Paul said? Because Paul added a but if to Jesus. He said, Jesus said don't separate, but if you do, don't remarry. Can we add another one saying, but if you do remarry, do it properly, live faithfully with your right intention? Because there's a logic to but if. Take it seriously. Don't get put out. It doesn't freeze frame. That's up for conversation. After this, Paul then goes on and he says to the rest that he faces a very strange situation to him, something utterly new. He doesn't have a command for Jesus, and he doesn't have something from the Old Testament. He says, to those with the unbelieving husband or wife, what do you do? We struggle to get this, because the church, as we've said, is fresh as can be. It's only been going a matter of a couple of decades. What do you do? They're asking. I've come to faith. My husband hasn't. Should I leave him? I mean, always a temptation, but and Paul says this, something very sensible. He says, no, stay put. Stay put. And his reason for it is something beautiful in a sense, something that should make us pause. He says, stay put, because those you live with are made holy, not considered holy, made holy by your presence, by the things you do, by the way you live, by the way you're open to God. Those you live with are made holy by your relationship with them, by the way they live with you. And who knows, that might save them. We think of holiness as something fragile, something that's easily contaminated. But Paul thinks of it as something strong, not something to do with you. Are you holy enough? You know, this is the kind of thing we worry about. Have you decided? Are you doing it properly? He says, no, you're holy because God is with you. And that holiness is contagious and will infect other people. Just like, you know, stories like Jesus and the widow of Nain, where he stops the death and the contamination, and his holiness is contagious, goes forward as a power that changes things, and he raises the son, the widow of Nain. That kind of thing. The contamination goes in the good direction more than in the bad. And that's what Paul is counting on. He said, don't feel like you have to go. He said, if your unbelieving partner won't live with you, well then, let them go. There's not much you can do about that. We're called to live in peace. But don't you feel like you have to rush off. Don't you feel like, if you're left, then you're left. And there's no extra guidance for that. There's no, don't get married. There's no, you just, you know, get on with life. And so the ifs and buts are taken very seriously. Now there's a work for the church. There's a work for community, for our society really. No judgmentalism. No, I'm with Paul, I'm with Apollos, I'm with Peter, whatever. But respecting that we're all living with our own contexts, our own ifs and buts, our own tragedies, our own strengths, our own joys. And how do we live that well? Paul won't lay down the law, but he will enter into very detailed conversation. No dividing, no boasting, no judging, but no minding your own business as well. Caring, connection, being involved with one another, deep-seated listening. If I have a problem, I'm going to say, why are you doing that? I don't understand, but I'll really listen. Let's talk these things through. Let's find consensus. Let's correct one another. And let's respect that we all are living our life of faith in different contexts. That way, Paul thinks, we will arrive at the mind of Christ. That way, the church becomes a healthy environment and one that is an example to a wider society that doesn't know how to deal with conflict and difference. Amen.